Time we get to the mix to present to Riz, we're all in the room together and we work through almost frame by frame. That would have been Riz and Ben in the room pushing us to more of an extreme than we managed to get to in the edit.
And this is why the role of showrunner is so important. He was there every day for the mix and every day of the shoot and every day of the edit. He knew what he wanted, and then you develop the shorthand. It was a really lovely experience.
Curious about creating high-quality YouTube videos? Enroll in video editing and production classes at Manhattan Edit Workshop to sharpen your skills and turn a hobby into a career. Start your journey to becoming a pro today.
Hey everybody, this is Josh from Manhattan Edit Workshop, welcoming you to the 60th episode of Sight, Sound, and Story, Inside the Sound of Bait. It's a new TV show on Prime Video. Maybe you have seen it, maybe you have heard it. We're going to talk about all the things that go on between your ears on that show with Re-recording Mixer Richard Davey, Supervising Sound Editor Jack Gillies, and Supervising Dialogue Editor Steve Berezai. This is moderated by Amy Leyland, who's she's a wonderful editor and instructor at Manhattan Edit Workshop. We're going to break down all the things that you're hearing and things that you're probably not even noticing, but you're feeling, and how important sound is to the overall shape of a show that you're watching, or an experience that you're having when you're sitting down and watching it. I love it. I used to be a sound guy before I was not actually anything else. It was my first job I ever had. So I really appreciate how important sound can be in a movie or a TV show. And that's why it's great to have people who are doing it at this high level talking about it here. So I'm going to thank our sponsors, American Cinema Editors, that's ACE. I'm going to thank, Jason Banky and Janet Dalton from Manhattan Edit Workshop, Filmmaker U, and Edit Stock. All you guys are making this happen, and we couldn't be more happy about that. So without further ado, Amy and the crew are going to take it away inside the sound of Bait.
All right. Thank you, Josh, for that intro. And my name is Amy Leyland, and I'm an avid certified instructor for Manhattan Edit Workshop. And I'm very excited today to be sitting down with the sound team from Bait, a new show on Prime Video, if anybody hasn't had a chance to watch it yet. And we're going to be talking about the sound process in that show and also post-production sound in general. And today we've got with us Steve Berezai, who's the supervising dialogue and ADR editor for the show. We've got Richard Davey, who's the re-recording mixer, and Jack Gillies, who's the supervising sound editor.
Right.
And I'd like to start first by just kind of with each one of you talking a little bit about where you were before the show Bait. And also, I notice a lot of interconnections between your professional credits. So I'd like to ask about that. So just if each one of you can just give us just a brief intro, what you've worked on, what brought you to the show Bait. I'd appreciate it. Maybe we can start with you, Steve.
We all work for the same company, John Buck. And yeah, I think I've been there since 2019. And sort of work across an array of different shows, mainly comedies and dramas. And this is why our CVs cross over quite a bit, I guess.
I mean, I think from my point of view, when we pitch for jobs through, with the company, we kind of pitch the people we feel like would be better suited to the job. That can be just because the CVs stand up well, or it could be a connection with someone on the production team, a post-production supervisor or something like that. And so I think this team was put together for one of those reasons. And so we, rather than a sort of a group of freelancers coming together onto the production, we went onto it as a team, a predetermined team.
Jack and I probably have worked together for like 25 years or something. Possibly doesn't look that way.
Shocking.
That way. But yeah, I was a runner at a company in Soho. Sorry, no, you were the runner at the company in Soho, weren't you, Jack? And I was a sort of assistant sound mixer. And then over the years, I was there for about 4 or 5 years. You went on to work with someone else, didn't you? And then I sort of formed this company called John Buck Film and Television in 2010. Which took a lot of our film and back in the day, I think we used to do more independent film, but we also did a lot of drama and comedy work. Another guy I set the business up with, a guy called Glenn Calder, who's a comedy mixer, and then Jack and Steve have come on board probably, Steve, you said like 7, 8 years ago. Jack, we've sort of worked together that whole time.
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
worked freelance with you for years and with Jumbuck, before I came on more, more of a sort of permanent position. That probably about 4 or 5 years ago. But
yeah.
I'd worked very very closely with Jumbuck for years before that as well, on a variety of projects. I mean, we
I can't remember exactly how I can't remember exactly how we came across this show. Although Jack reminded me earlier that a lot of the picture edit crew were sort of some of the sort of very well respected comedy edit crews in the UK. So Jack and I, back in 2012, 13, we worked on a show called Veep, which is an HBO show. Which was created by Armando Iannucci, and a lot of the picture editors on Veep also were picture editors on Bait. And there may have been some connections that way. Jack and I both worked with Riz Ahmed, the showrunner, show creator, and sort of lead actor in this, on a short film long time ago, which is sort of loosely based on some of the ideas from this. I don't think that's how we came to work on this because I think he'd forgotten. But
Well, I
yeah,
think it was an easy way of saying,
yeah,
here's a
we
team. Oh, and
pitched.
by the way, you may not remember them, but you worked
Yeah,
on it was one of his first directorial sort of forays in. It was a short film, um, and I think we also had worked on. We worked on Shifty, which Riz was in. You
yeah.
worked on Road to Guantanamo, that Riz was in as well. So
Yeah, I've met him a few
there
times over the
was a
years.
connection
He'd done a
there
few things with
with
Michael
that.
Winterbottom who I've worked with. So yeah, it's it's a fairly small world post in the UK. I think everyone knows everyone. And I think we knew quite a few of the production crew, and we knew Riz, and yeah, and it came about that way. But it's possibly to do with shared CVs as well. And as I said, Steve, Jack, and I have worked on all sorts of stuff together over the years: comedies, dramas, features, documentaries. But this show is quite interesting because it isn't really kind of any one thing. It's sort of slightly a comedy in some ways. It's set up the shoot and the sort of edit originally was set up a little bit like a comedy schedule. Um,
Well, it
but
was
then a
certainly
little
pitched as a comedy, I think.
it was, yeah.
That's certainly when we first heard about it. It was like, oh, there's a comedy show. Let's crew up for a comedy show.
It was
But
like
it
a half
quickly
hour
became
Amazon slot, wasn't it?
exactly half-hour comedy. So it was classic sort of setup, really, for a comedy show.
Yeah,
Uh, but
and
yeah,
then yeah, as we sort of got more into it and met with Riz more, and you discovered that actually, whilst it sort of had quite a lot of comedy elements, certainly quite early on, it was a bit more obviously comedy genre, but then it very quickly became quite a sort of mixture of genres. There's sort of suspense and thriller, and a lot of sort of cultural stuff, which is beautiful in the early episodes, and then it sort of becomes it gets sort of it just goes all over the place.
One thing I would like to do before we get specifically into bait is these panels are going to be seen by a variety of audience, including editors who haven't necessarily worked in post-production sound, and maybe even people who are aspiring to get into post-production, who are still figuring out where they want to be. And I was hoping for their sake that each of you could just take a moment to describe what your title and role is within the sound team, what the responsibilities of that role are, and then however you all want to do it, describe how those come together as a collaborative.
So I am the dialogue and ADR editor, and it's my job to basically go through all of the sound for the show and clean it up as much as I can. Anything that I can't clean up, we get the actors back in and get them in for ADR and re-record their lines. And along with that, we do crowd recording sessions for all the sort of backgrounds, edit it all up and send it on to Richard in the mix, basically.
my role would be supervising sound editor, which primarily involves sound effects, but also quite a kind of a way to sort of bridge the gap, because quite often the gap needs to be bridged between, for example, music and sound design, sometimes between dialogue, and especially where with the crowd recordings and sound effects. And so I will, start off by creating a world for for the show for Bait, for example, and that will be, directed first of all by the showrunner or the director. And once that world starts being built, other elements start coming into it, like sound design and how that's going to work with music, and how the dialogue is working. Are there any kind of tricky scenes that involve something a little bit different than just sort of standard dialogue? Is there going to be a scene which involves some sort of sound design around the dialogue? And then we kind of bring it all together in the edit towards the end of the process, again, before we sort of hand over to Richard.
So I'm the re-recording mixer. I kind of come last in the process chronologically, and these guys generally have been working on it for like a good few weeks or months before I get involved. They would, alongside our Foley team as well. We have Foley recording, Foley studio and recordists at Jumbuck, and that's the sort of the fourth person who's probably not here. The three elements really is sort of dialogues, Foley, and effects. Would deliver to me in the studio, and then my process begins with a premix, which is kind of my opportunity to go through the tracks, work out what we've got, just start to make the dialogues sound filmic, adding reverb and matching in the ADR and making the crowd sound real and nice. Then I'd generally put in probably the effects and the Foley together, especially on a show like this. Foley was really important to make it sound quite sort of authentic and real. Mix the sound effects, sort of, I think this was a 5:1 mix, and so it would be panning things around or working out what to do with the sound design, all of which is generally kind of unattended in terms of client involvement. But obviously what's happened at the very beginning is, which we probably all skipped, is that the first thing to happen is as soon as they lock the episodes, we go and watch the episodes with the crew. So with the showrunner, producers, directors, and so on in the cutting room to get
the editors as well.
Yeah. So that's their opportunity to convey to us what they're looking for. Those instructions and details and notes get worked on by Jack and Steve, and then when it comes to my role, I sort of build everything up and do a kind of a version. I can prepare a version in the premix, so that when the client comes in on the first day of the final mix, I can press play, and they'll go, "Yeah, it's great," or they'll say, "No, it needs to change." And then at that point we then sit down, and actually for this show for Bait, we had Riz and Ben, who are the showrunners on the show. They were with us the whole time, or most of the time. And then they would sort of then start to give their notes, and at that point I take everything I've done and usually change quite a lot of it, because
I think it's important to say that even at this stage, no decisions have been finalized. So we have kind of all options still on the table right up until the end. And quite often that means having too many options on the table. And then we work out which options we don't need and which options we do need. And it gives us a chance to, try, see how different bits of the sound fit with the clients in the room. In fact, we'd all be there in the room together, and it might involve a bit of trial and error. We'll go over certain scenes over and over again with different options and try different ideas, and we'll settle on a path through it.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you hope that by the end you've worked out what everyone wants. But certainly, sometimes you can prepare it a certain way, and then you end up going a completely different route, or you watch it, you work on it quite sort of bit by bit, and then you get to the end and you watch it and you go, "Oh, do you know what? That whole sequence doesn't really work. We need to think of something different." And then we're all there, and we then chip in new ideas if it's new recordings or new, more ADR or more crowd or different sound effects. And the other part we've not talked about is that also we had Jamie, the music editor, who was working alongside the composers. He was in the mix as well. And there's a huge amount of music editing and wrangling going on in this show. There's a lot of source music, a lot of scored music, and his role was to sort of bring all those together, respond in the room to changes that Riz or Ben might have had to sort of hit the right narrative beats or emotional moments, and everyone's sort of slightly sort of beavering away in the room, trying to sort of keep the direction of traffic sort of travel in the right direction so that you get to the
Yeah.
end and you watch it together, and hopefully it's what people want.
I'm glad you mentioned Jamie then, Richard, because actually, again, he's a sort of maybe a fifth person that's not here, but
Yeah.
um, on different shows, sort of music editors have a larger or smaller role to play. Certainly on Bait, he had quite a large role to play because there was a certain amount of sound design that Riz wanted to sort of do with the music, and in terms of non-musical elements. So halfway through the edit, Jamie contacted me and said, "Hey, look, we're coming up with a lot of stuff over here. Are you aware of it? And do you want to hear it? And do you need to add to it or play with it?" And so what we ended up doing was they prepared a lot of that stuff in the music department and then sent all of the non-music elements over to me to then put into the sound effects and then sort of to play with from a sound effect point of view. Um, and that often doesn't happen on a show. Sometimes even if it needs to happen, that won't happen until we get to the mix, and then it's all quite complicated. But luckily, Jamie had the foresight to contact me way before we got into the studio, and we sorted a lot of the kind of issues with that crossover early on.
And that collaboration, by the way, is so obvious in the show because this is something I will ask more about later. But one of the things that impressed me the most about the show is how we normally think of the scoring of a show as being the music, but the whole show in a way feels scored with all of the sound. Like it felt like a score, an underscore of dialogue, of crowd sound, of sound effects, of music. It felt like one combined score in a really beautiful way. And you've just explained exactly why, because you're right that collaboration between departments isn't always the default. And knowing that you all were scoring this show together, it shows in the final product. And that's really fantastic.
We should give credit to Riz and Ben. Riz was very, very inspiring guy to work with. Hugely talented. Obviously, he'd written it, he'd starred in it. So it was kind of weird, I think, to start with for him to be sort of spending obviously he'd been in the edit and it was the same, spending all that time sort of watching himself and critiquing his own scenes. But he had a very, very strong sense of wanting to sort of paint and add texture to the soundtrack to the show with soundtrack, and whether that was whether that was crowd, whether that was sort of just like fizzy buzzing dialogue going on throughout scenes in multiple layers, foreground and background, whether it was kind of sound effects, real or designed, or sometimes it would be music where the music would be diegetic and then suddenly it would become non-diegetic, or you'd think it's diegetic and it's not diegetic. And also Riz was picking these crazy sounding tracks sometimes, which like quite sort of 90s deliberately sort of grungy sounding tracks in places, and then other stuff was really lush. And wasn't there a Georgia Smith track in there as well, which was recorded for the
I think especially written, that track.
It was recorded especially for the show, so that was really exciting to get that track, which I think I literally heard it on the radio a few weeks ago. So there was such an incredible range of sort of sound elements, but none of them were sort of pigeonholed into being one particular thing. So the score wasn't all strings and piano, and the sound effects wasn't all birds and atmospheres. There was big, deep, rich environmental sounds in some places, and then really designy stuff. And the crowd, again, the sort of crowd interplay between the effects and Jack and Steve. A lot of the scenes were constructed from the ground up with a mixture of crowd, as in ADR recorded crowd, which I think you'd probably call loop group in America, and sound effects crowd, which of course you couldn't just chuck any old crowd on. It had to be the right sort of age and voices and language sometimes. It was a really interesting challenge, but I think the result, as you said, is that it's a rich soundtrack where the sound really is adding to the experience quite
Yeah,
rich.
I mean, I would say that we were being pushed, and you'd agree, Steve, probably that you think you're kind of bringing enough to the table, and then Riz would be like, "Come on, that's 50% of what we need here." And on a lot of shows, we'd be like, "Oh, is this too busy?"
We'll be home by then. Yeah.
And he's like, "No, double it. Let's really let's really go for it. And I remember sort of kind of worrying about that to begin with, and then when we did push it, realizing that actually it did work really well. So it's kind of fair to say that Riz did have quite strong sort of conviction about certain areas of the show that we tried to kind of like replicate. Although on the other hand, he did like in the spotting sessions, there were a few occasions where he said, "Look, I'm not sure about where we are with this yet. We maybe haven't got the concept like fully kind of in our mind. Like go away and come up with some ideas, throw these ideas our way, and we'll see if it works. So if it doesn't, So it was it was a big variety of sort of ways of working, really.
I'd like to show an example of this. And it's funny, one of the things, all of this that you all are talking about, when I watched the show, having been told, hey, you're going to do this panel with the sound team, I then went and watched the entire show and immediately thought, what a great show to talk about sound because of how important it is. And I want to talk that we're going to go to this first clip, which seems like just a dialogue scene, but it in fact has so much going on. And in some ways, for me, the dialogue felt scored and orchestrated. And so I'd like to show the clip and then talk a little bit about how that was done.
Oh my God. Sharp, are you going to be the next James Bond?
What?
Huh? Wait. It might be cut. Can
I have a look at that?
Oh shit! No, it's legit! What the fuck? Oh my God, who's born? This is crazy! Wait, chill, man!
Check the website, it's BBC, we can't trust him.
Craig Daniel, मर गया क्या साला?
Bro, why didn't you tell me?
It's just an audition.
Super James Bond, mera Shaju.
Listen, it's an audition. It's a photo from today's audition. That's all it is.
Oh man, James Bond is white.
चुप हरामजादे हमेशा नजर लगाता मेरे बच्चों को चुप
I'm the haramzada. He's playing. Do you know how much sex James Bond does? वो तो sex करता है, पाप करते हैं.
तो करता है तो क्या हो गया? तो उसमें क्या हो गया?
I'm the harami and he's shaggy.
ये उन लोगों का मुल्क है, इनको भड़काओ नहीं.
Listen, Baba, it's okay to be a little bit excited. It's nice even just to have the opportunity. It's a big deal, Brown James Bond. You should be proud.
It's this guy's face is gonna be fucking blasted everywhere. Imagine it.
Daniel Craig got paid 20 M's for the last movie.
My Shaju will get 21.
It's just calm down. It's just an audition, yeah?
Call me if you need a body double for sex scenes.
Hello? Chup bro. Could you tell her to call me as soon as she comes back in? Yeah, sure.
Okay, phone kar dena.
Look to sahi 2 minutes.
I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. I just got to sort this out and work it out.
Cuz, yo, look at me. I'm proud of you.
I mean, it's so good because you listen closely to that clip and there's one sound effect at the very beginning and then the rest is all voices. And yet you get a sense of a crescendo of sound and music and all that in the voices. And I'd love to hear more about, Steve, obviously this is going to fall very much into your wheelhouse. I'd love to hear more about that process and how that worked. And of course, it sounds like we're listening to a live recording of a bunch of people in the room at one time, but I'm guessing that's not what happened. So I'd love to hear more about that.
General process is to kind of go through, at the start of every job, every episode, go through and work out what we need to ADR. And this particular scene, what they wanted to do in the edit is make it chaotic, as chaotic as possible. So, they've removed any air that was there. And, sometimes I think they've cut away some lines that maybe weren't working to just give it a real pace to it. So the challenging thing for me is we want to keep that raw energy. We want to keep as much of that original performance as possible. But the way they have to cut it is the principal lines are on the same recording as the background lines, where you've got, say, Q, the cousin on the sofa, shouting in the background over various takes. So what you end up with is the background lines getting butted together. So you might have the front of her line from one particular take gets butted against, the second half of a line from a different take, and it jars a bit. So yeah, it's a fine line because you don't want to just mark up everything and re-record everything because, like I say, there's that nice raw energy to it. So I marked up, the glaringly obvious stuff that's got these overlaps in the background. And yeah, went into ADR, and I mean, this is the sort of thing that actors are generally like, this sounds great. Let's not touch this. So sometimes it takes a little bit of convincing, because ultimately, what I want to do is send a clean version of every line to the mix, whether it gets used or not. So yeah, that was very much the intention. I think the guys were generally happy to record most of the lines, and then I think what we've ended up with in the mix is sticking with some ADR. And then going back to some of the original sync. I can hear a couple of background edits, but they're kind of nice anyway. They're not perfect, but it's like it gives it like a pace to it, and that's what they want. They want the chaos. So yeah, I think some of that original stuff went back in, and maybe there's a couple of really bad ones that they've stuck with the ADR there. And this new line of ADR, obviously it goes in clean, so you then have to record another background line of ADR to keep the chaos sort of going. And yeah, I think it's turned out well. Like I say,
it was quite challenging in the mix, I think, that because as Steve said, like you could put a version together where you're just using all the ADR lines, and then he's also given me a version where we've got like lines from the mum and dad and Q and all the sort of various characters there. You sort of try and recreate, don't you, the chaos of lots of people talking, but it never quite feels as chaotic as the version that they send you that they've edited in the cutting room, where there really are just people talking all over the place. But that wouldn't work really because it's too disruptive, and technically it sort of feel weird. And equally, just ADR often doesn't work either because it just loses a little bit of that energy and vibe. And so yeah, the challenge is to put in the bits of we call it sync, the production sound, where we can. If we run into problems with lines getting cut off because we've cut to a different line or whatever, then that's when maybe we'll use half a line from the ADR to get us over the tricky point. Or you sort of have to sort of break it down, sort of create a clean well, in a lot of ways you sort of create the cleanest version you can from the dialogue that's available, and then you sort of go searching again for what elements you might need that would make it busier in sort of feel for how it was when you first heard it and it was sort of unusable technically. So there's this sort of weird process of you sort of break it all down into sort of ADR parts, and then build it back up, and then it's not quite good enough, and then you add other stuff. So in there, I can remember like lots of conversations like with Jack, you may recall, but it would just be there'd be conversations about, well, like, what can we put in this scene to busy it up that isn't dialogue, but gives the feeling of whatever that feel of a busy room with lots of people talking, which isn't added lines that we don't want. So obviously Steve had covered all the lines, but there's only so many lines you can put in. There's only so many characters talking at once. I mean, I can hear a few where we've added lines underneath other lines, and they're sort of deliberately held down because you don't want them to be distracting. But if you do that too much, you start to feel it, and then it sort of falls to Jack to then provide the glue, I'd say, that makes the scene work. And it's interesting you said they didn't feel like there's many sound effects in there, and I think that's one of the sort of skills of a good sound edit is there's not a lot of action sort of we'd call them spot effects, like doors or phones or whatever. There's a lot of things happening on the screen, but there's a lot of kind of I can't think shash. I guess it's shash.
Yeah,
and
I mean, it was kind of it's a strange one, and it's difficult to hear because obviously I heard that back on my laptop. So you kind of you're just hearing the dialogue pump through. But if you were hearing it on a sort of more more of a kind of hi-fi, bigger speakers and stuff, You'd hear there is some stuff in the background, and what we tried to do was turn up the Foley in places. But the Foley, although the Foley sounded great, it when you sort of turn it up, it sounds quite clean, and sort of, especially because you're in a living room, you're not putting huge amounts of reverb on it, whatever. So we went digging for that kind of production sound shash to kind of help glue some of those bits together, if there was any kind of areas where we felt like possibly going from sync to ADR, or kind of if there was a lot of movement on screen and you're not kind of getting enough of that kind of sense of movement, we would sort of put in that, it's stuff that you really, your ear doesn't pick up on, but it kind of helps to glue it together. Like Richard said, it's like, it's a strange one actually. And when Richard asked for it at the time, I was like, what am I supposed to do?
What is that?
What am I supposed to do with that? And
actually,
it's
there's a good example. There's a good
works.
example in that clip, which actually it just cut off just as we got to it, because I remember distinctly in the mix. There's a moment where Shah and Zulfi go to the sort of the hallway, and they have a little joke about do they know that Shah's not tall enough? And there's supposed to be this like quiet moment where like Zulfi's taking the piss and there's sort of like a few sort of awkward pauses, and obviously because they shot that sequence separately as a completely different setup, it didn't have the whole family in the other room still talking. It was just dead, like a dead setup. So
the energy suddenly drops at that point.
And so Riz, one of the things we end up changing quite a bit was, we cut to it, and then suddenly we've gone for this really busy, frenetic scene where everyone's getting really excited and talking over each other and shouting at each other, and suddenly you cut to the two-hander, and then it going completely silent. And so then we had to go through a process of sort of like reconstructing the family continuing to talk off screen to each other, which I think, Steve, is a process of you going back through the rushes and talking to the editors and finding stuff that we could use. And obviously we have to get it all translated as well, because it has to actually make sense.
I think I got some extra stuff in ADR. I just let them all have a run at that scene, just in case they wanted to make it even more chaotic. We got some stuff in the back pocket, and because we had the mic open for a couple of minutes, there was just bits and pieces of that we could pick out and place that still sort of worked, some ad libs and what have you.
I imagine also there was bits even in that scene, like when, for example, Shah goes over to the window, when they're filming that sort of thing. I mean, and throughout, obviously, when we start off with Q on the sofa, that everyone's kind of in that little pocket area there, but the action sort of moves over to the other side of the room, and obviously, when you're shooting that stuff, the likelihood is that everyone sort of goes quiet to allow the action to happen, because they don't need to be talking all over everyone's lines. You wouldn't choose to talk over people's lines on set if you could avoid it. But then, of course, every single time the action cuts further away, like the other side of the room or whatever, you still have to keep all that energy going. And so this is a bit of a beast, wasn't it? This scene for you, Steve, I think.
I think from a mixing point of view, though, what was interesting hearing that back was that there are lots of really key lines in there, lots of funny lines, lots of little story points or kind of points of the relationships that the different people, the different family members have and stuff. And so there are parts of lines which are you just cannot hear because there are two or three people talking over each other at one time. But then you've got the end of the line, which is important. I mean, one that always jumps out to me was, if it's the BBC, you can't trust them. That line from Gus. So it's a great line. And what he says before it, and whoever's talking over him, you can't hear. It's inaudible. But by the time you get to it, it's just sort of finding that and then pushing that up, as you did, Richard, and it's finding those individual lines which really matter and then putting those to the forefront for just a split second so your ear picks up on them, and then back into the chaos of three people talking. And then
there's a lot of sort of pulling focus, isn't there, as a sort of visual reference. But to pull focus in a scene like that, you have to, and that's something we learned on Veep, I think, quite a lot. I mean, that Veep is a show, incredibly good show, ran for like 8 years, I think, and that is a show where really there would often be like 15 people in a room, all sort of vying. They're all brilliant comedians, all incredible performers, and the writing was such strong writing, and they'd all have one-liners, and you'd literally be having to sort of like pick from one person to the next person to the next person to the next person, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't feel like it's jumpy and cutty, and that it was very well edited in the first place. very well performed and written. But yeah, it's nice that it feels so fluid, because there's a lot of sort of pedaling under the water going on to make the show, to make that scene feel like that.
Yeah.
Now that you
And
bring it up.
what I love about everything that you all are talking about too is that I think this is such an important thing for people to understand about something like a sound department. Is I think a lot of people are under the mistaken impression that editors, sound mixers, that they're technicians and doing a purely technical job. And I love that everything you all are talking about is, yes, there's a technical job to it, but it's a technical job that serves the storytelling. That it is about, you all need to understand the characters as well as everybody else, so you know which line to pull out in the. And this is why I talked about this scene feeling almost orchestrated to me. It felt like you had all of these instruments playing together, and you had to know, in this measure, we need to pull this instrument out a little bit more because it's more important to the overall score. And that's exactly how this scene felt.
I've always felt
it was very successful.
Yeah, I've always felt with mixing, I think you'd probably say this is relatively comedy, this scene. I've always felt with mixing that there's certain rules with mixing that are norms. And then when you're mixing comedy, like, you start with the norms for mixing, and then you have a whole set of other rules that apply to comedy and don't really apply to conventional drama. And this is something that Armando taught us a lot when we were working with him, is that you've got to get the line that you need to hear up, and everything else out of the way immediately. And if there's anything that gets in the joke, that, like, the BBC line is a great one, because it's like, oh, it's the BBC, we can't trust them. It's like 3 seconds. If you let something else, whether it was a sound effect or another dialogue line, linger over for like 5 frames, overlapping Zulfi's line, you might miss the line, and then you lose the joke. And so, whilst you work in creating the sort of various elements to support one another, you then have to, with comedy in particular, you have to be really ruthless with how you mix it. And so you have to get the line that you need to hear up, and you have to get the other lines down in a way that doesn't sound like you've turned them down, because your ear and your brain naturally ignore, if you're in a room and someone tells you something, your brain doesn't notice that you're not listening to the other people anymore. But with sound, with sort of, when you're making a soundtrack, you have to do that brain work for the viewer. And so you have to get the other lines out the way really fast. And then you can't have a gap of like a half a second after the joke. You just got to get the next one in. And it's that sort
I think Armando said, well, I think we got it wrong on occasions on Veep, for example. And Armando literally said, come on, guys, it's comedy. In comedy, I want to hear the funny thing, and I want to not hear the not funny thing. It was like, okay, got it.
Yeah, and you sort of mix it a certain way, and then you have to go, oh, hang on a minute, this actually isn't funny anymore. And then you have another, you sort of almost like, sometimes you're mixing with like square edges, like up, down, up, down, up, down. And I think that's why this scene works quite well, because there's so many characters delivering so many lines that actually it's almost like sort of shining a little spotlight on each person who speaks. And
of course, what we don't want to do is distract with anything else. It's like, okay, we're in the living room. Have we got car passes outside? Well, no, we don't. That's not funny. That's not going to add to. It's just going to distract. So we kind of like, it's like just step on any distraction at that point.
And I think that's what made this show quite tricky overall, is because that style of mixing applied to this scene, whereas I think maybe some of the other clips we'll watch, they're not comedy at all. And so they're completely different genre and completely different motivations and emotional reaction and beats and timings and all of that. It required quite a lot of dexterity in terms of sort of disciplines and genres, which maybe again partly why we were in the frame for the show, because we do have a lot of comedy heritage, but we've also done a lot of serious dramas as well. So that probably played into that, I think.
I feel like because you've provided the absolutely perfect transition, that we will actually look at another clip. One of the things you all talked about at the very beginning, that to me was really a big part of what I took away from this show, was that it is not just a comedy. It plays at the beginning like a comedy, and then you start to see these other elements come in. And as we start to see more and more that we're seeing what's inside of Shaw's head bleeding into what he's seeing in front of him. And we start to see his insecurities and his fears coloring the world around him. And we start to see these other genres come in, partly because we're talking about James Bond, and partly, all of these different things. we start to see these genres blending together. And so the next clip that I want to take a look at is one where we start to see this happening. And for me, this is still, we're still in the first episode, but this clip is later in the episode. And it's for me that moment when you start to say, oh, we're not just going to laugh here. There's going to be more happening. And so I'd like to watch the clip and then talk a little bit about how you all put that together.
Shot, man. There's like a lot of hate coming at you on the internet right now. Just don't pay attention to it, right? It's all bullshit.
London, are you ready for taste?
हमें निशानी दे मेरे मौला कि हम सही रास्ते पे जा सके हम भटक गए हम सबको माफ फरमा मेरे मौला हमारी मुसीबतों को दूर फरमा अल्लाह ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह
Salami. Fuck. Yeah. 007.
But like I said, when I was told about this panel, I first watched the whole show. And as I watched that scene, I thought, oh man, I hope that's one of the clips they send over. Because it's so great. So first of all, if we were just talking about a nightclub scene, I would have so many questions for you about how you got that all put together. Because I mean, I think we've all seen the behind the scenes of it was a nightclub, but while they were dancing, there was actually no music playing. It was really quiet. Like there's so many sound issues just for a nightclub scene. And then all of a sudden there's more layered on. And there is a moment in that scene that I just want to say, as somebody who appreciates sound, but has never worked in actual sound mixing myself, the moment where the sound effects from the text crescendo into the beat of the music, chef's kiss, beautiful. That was so well done. But I also think that what this scene for me represented is, again, this is this first sign that we're not talking about just a comedy. We start with a nightclub scene. It starts to twist into something else. Then we see the sound distorting because of his mental state. And then that pig's head comes flying through the window, and suddenly the score to me sounds like one from a horror movie. There's just so much going on, and I don't know how you talk about this without taking an hour, but if there's any way you all can find a way to discuss as, you know, relatively succinctly, how did you do this? It was wonderful and amazing.
Well, I mean, I'll just jump in quickly and just say, well, first of all, some of the decisions are obviously made in the edit there. So there was like, you know, we go into the spotting session and we watch a scene which looks quite like the scene that you've seen there. But then as the sort of edit develops and as the sound develops and as the mix developed, actually, we the picture ended up becoming recut in some areas, and the kind of concepts for various bits, like the text messages, for example, kind of changed and kind of morphed into other things. And so it was kind of like a long process. So I suppose to begin with, we approached it like a conventional you know, TV show. You know, Steve would have gone away and worked on the dialogues. I would have worked on the effects, you know, made of the atmosphere of the club. work in the different areas of the club. You've got the VIP room, then you've got the kind of little ante room where Shah looks at his phone, and then you've got the big club scene. And so you kind of like do a conventional pass, I would say, of the sound on it, and then play, go from that point, play with that as a starting point, and then try and get into Shah's head. So really, I guess it's from the point where he gets told that there's a lot of hate for him on the internet. That's the point at which kind of the rug gets pulled from under his, he kind of goes into the club feeling like the big man, and then all of a sudden he's insecure. And it's a sort of big turn. And from that point, the world sort of changes. And so I mean, I guess, during the edit, I would bring some ideas to the table. So I would kind of introduce a drone at that point, possibly pull the crowd away a little bit in the edit, make him feel a bit uneasy. Then with the text messages, sync up some text message sounds. And then kind of with the club scene, when the lights go on and off and the sound cuts in and out, that was an idea that was presented in the edit, but it was quite kind of messy. The sound wasn't really sunk up with anything. So I'd go through there and sync up with the picture where the lights go off, the sound would disappear and come back. But I went for something quite kind of brutal where the whole sound disappeared. And then by the time we get to the mix, there's a sort of rough shape, so to speak, to present to Riz. And then Riz and Ben were like, yeah, it's kind of works, but it's not really kind of giving us what we need. And at that point, we're all in the room together and we work through almost frame by frame. I mean, sort of every couple of seconds, something needs to change, something needs to be enhanced, something needs to be exaggerated. And then that's sort of, creatively that would have been Riz and Ben in the room pushing us sort of to more of an extreme than we'd managed to get to in the edit.
I think sometimes what happens is like someone, whether it's Riz or Ben or me or Jack or Steve, will come up with an idea, and you always have to sort of try and evaluate whether that is going to be a 3-hour process that you explore and results in nothing. I remember Jamie, bless him, he went through so many different iterations of the music for that sequence. Because actually, what's interesting with the music in that sequence is it starts off with just like background club music and there's background club stuff. When we get into the room where he starts reading his phone, we obviously, the music sort of, there's like a bed. I couldn't really tell listening to that. Actually, it's really weird seeing it back. It's a great sequence, and I enjoyed it probably more that time than I did when I was working on it, because without worrying about whether it was right or not. But yeah, you sort of got these sort of suspended strings that go through that section, and then the point at the drums, the sort of really loud percussive drums come in. I can't even remember what those drums were, or whether they were scored drums or whether they were drums taken from a source element, but that was always going to be the sort of driving force that is the sort of Riz, right, come on Riz, come and Shah, sorry, come and do your thing emceeing. But when we decided to then, and obviously there's some lovely visual cues that we had to work with, like the lights going out. That was something that we started to try with, as Jack said, he'd cut this sound, and then we tried cutting all of the music every time the lights went off. But what we found is
silence and back again.
Yeah, like sort of almost like completely up to nothing. But then when you watch it back, it's just a bit too brutal to cut all the sound out the whole time. And so what we decided in the end is that we would cut out, can't even remember now. I think we cut out the what was playing as diegetic, which was the drums and the percussion and the sort of
the crowd,
sort of loud clubby music. Underneath that, there was other music like pads and things, and there was also crowd sort of like in the room. That stays. I think each time does the crowd cut in and out? Can't even remember.
The crowd cuts out. The crowd cuts in and out, basically.
Crowd cuts in and out.
The drum goes all the way through.
we left the drone and the drums, I think, in
Yeah,
there.
but some of the elements of the music cut out and some of them don't. And it took a little
Yeah,
while of working out what was gonna, because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to allow the viewer to get into the head of to get into Shah's head. And if you play that, if you try and do it with too strong a hand, or if you try and a move that's too visible as a sound crew, I think what happens is you vault straight over the sort of opportunity to get into someone's head, and you start to just be aware of the process. And so what you don't want to do is do something that's so self-conscious in the soundtrack that it actually distracts you from what's actually going on, which is that Shah's having a breakdown. So it had to be something, there had to be like a holding hand that sort of pulled you through the club to when he's sort of having his moment. And I think that's when the tinnitus effect kicks in, as that's the thing, all goes chaotic, and then you get that tinnitus and everything goes calm for a minute. And it's just you're trying to put in elements that narratively tell the story whilst also being dramatically important in terms of cutting the sound in and out to make it abrupt and abrasive and jarring and something that's maybe going to push him into that state. And as you said, I'd also forgotten this. The way the tweets start to appear is really effective because they start off quite gentle and then they've got this sort of like jagged,
distortion,
serrated sort of distortion on them, which is a really lovely effect. And as you say, it all feels very choreographed into the beat that comes in. And then the beat's going crazy by the time he gets up on the stage, and then the beat syncs perfectly with the big door burst at the end. And then you have that really beautiful music and that beautiful Islamic prayer that comes in over it. It's just so unexpected to hear that. And it's subtitled, which is really nice. But you just get this moment of like complete tranquility after that chaotic scene in the club. And then Riz's sort of Shah's, so his character name and real name, Shah, is then sort of reflecting on his life choices. And actually, I couldn't help laughing when I saw the pig as well, because the pig obviously then becomes this hilarious character later on in the show. But the first time you see the pig, it's like, oh my God. Like that's so dark. Yet at the same time, like slightly after that shot, you get this really funny text on Riz's phone, which is like Shah's phone, which is like, you've got the interview. And so the whole way through, they're sort of playing with your emotions in a way that you can't necessarily predict, which I think is why it works really well.
From a technical point of view, you've got to give it to the editors, picture editors, in terms of the rhythm they create. Because in the end, like, when I create sound effects, I'm punctuating the rhythm of the cut. And the cut had a few, like 2 or 3 different iterations as we were working on it. They reordered some of the scenes, or they shortened something, and then they decided they wanted to put some more dialogue in or something like that, and they lengthened it again. But the end result was something that had a great rhythm. And so the text messages, the cuts from scene to scene, and then the rhythm of the text messages coming in, and then as the drumming music comes in, that has a rhythm which works with the rhythm of the cuts. And obviously, that was kind of like, that wasn't an accident. That obviously Jamie had worked very hard on how the music comes in, the placement of the music and stuff. And then elements like the text messages, again, we went around the houses on that in terms of what it should sound like. In the edit, I was given the distortion noise actually that comes in at the end. They had basically put that on all of the text messages. So from the very first one that comes up, you've got that kind of quite distorted, high-pitched, sort of crunchy sound. And for me, that was a bit too, it was sort of selling the concept too early. So I went the other direction, and I did a more kind of like sort of pingy sound, like a bleep or whatever, like a sort of I don't know, like a text message sound, which when Riz first heard it, he was like, what have you done? It's completely wrong. And I was like, okay, well, we'll pull it back. And then we ended up with a click, like a little kind of almost like an iPhone typing sound to start with. And then I introduced the distortion sound that was originally coming in at the beginning, halfway through, as it gets more and more intense. And that was something that, again, it was a sort of maybe 3rd or 4th attempt in the mix with Riz there to basically, push it back in the right direction that he wanted to, after I'd gone in the wrong direction, if you know what I mean. So
I remember we spent a long time on that scene, to be
we
fair.
did. And I think we came back to it
over and over.
I think after we had finished the mix and we were in the kind of final review sort of stage, we still hadn't quite nailed it.
That was one of the last things we got right, I think.
It was, yeah.
But the other thing to say about the rhythm is that, like, in fairness, Riz is an incredible musician. He's an MC in real life. Like, he lives and breathes all that music and that culture, and that was such a big part of this. I mean, it's not autobiographical, but it's, there's so much of Riz in this show. He wrote it himself. Like, that sort of the sort of British Muslim cultural side was very personal to him. It was all set around Eid. We took a lot of guidance from him in terms of getting that right. And lots of places, sort of the brick. You probably haven't been to Brick Lane in London, but there's sort of culturally we go to Brick Lane in episode 4, I think, when you're sort of walking around. It's noisy and it's just so much life and buzz going on, but it's a certain sort of life and a certain sound, and it doesn't sound like Soho and it doesn't sound like somewhere else. It's got a certain vibe to it. But he was always very, very conscious of the musical elements to it. And a lot of those musical choices were things that just tracks that he liked or tracks that reminded him of his youth. I think we see young Shah getting beaten up by some white guys at the beginning. And these are all experiences that he will have had. And he was very much telling that story, not about himself necessarily, but about his experiences growing up. And these are places he'd hang out. And so it was very personal to him that it felt and sounded, particularly Riz was really into sound. It needed to sound right. And so we could present a bunch of options, but then it was always that kind of, let's push this bit further, or let's pull back here. So many scenes where we really needed his input in terms of, does this feel authentic to your original vision and your experiences? Which again is not something we get to do very much. It was, we've worked on, Jane Austen programs, or things set in London, or bomb disposals, or like,
Viking.
The Last Kingdom Vikings, where you're sort of imagining what it sounds like. But this was someone really telling a lot of their sort of life history, life experiences in film, and it was a lovely opportunity to sort of immerse ourselves and indulge in that sort of cultural side that we don't get to tell an awful lot.
I mean, Riz had quite a lot of very kind of strong opinions about how a club should sound, for example. And so if we were to do a sort of what I might call a traditional club scene, we'd have, you'd hear crowd, you'd hear the music, you'd put the music through the right kind of reverb, so it sounds like it's bouncing around the room, it's nice and loud, but then you make room for the dialogue, so whatever, and then you have that kind of, film style club scene. But Riz was like, no, that's not how it would sound like. First of all, you wouldn't hear these people talking because it would be too loud. Like, why am I hearing these people in the corner? Like, just get rid of them. And the music doesn't sound as distorted enough. Like, it always feels distorted to me when I'm in a club. And there's no point in saying, well, actually it's not, because clubs don't sound like that. It's about his lived experience and how he wants to present that lived experience on the screen, and we're having to sort of translate that, him telling us that to the screen or to the speakers, in as best we can. And quite often that involves a bit of trial and error, playing something not quite right, push it this way, not quite right, pull it back, getting warmer. It's sort of a little bit of that dynamic, and that's part of the fun, really.
But I think that's why the soundtrack is so cohesive, isn't it? Because throughout and this is why the role of showrunner is so important, is because he was there every day. He was there every day of the mix and every day of the shoot and every day of the edit, and he really knew. He's a very, very talented man. He knew what he wanted, and he knew he could help. He could steer us in the right direction. And after a few days with him, we worked out the stuff that he liked and the stuff that wasn't working so well, and then you develop this shorthand where the process gets sort of quicker and quicker, and everyone sort of understands the sort of stylistic things that you're setting up. And so the early apps are always a bit more complicated, and then you get a bit of a rhythm. But he was there throughout, and very, very very, very generous with his input and so on. It was a really lovely experience.
That's fantastic. And it also obviously lends very well to the fact that a lot of what this show is seeing something very deeply from one character's personal point of view. So having the showrunner being the person helping you provide that personal point of view obviously made that very successful. I do want to look at this one last clip. So we have an interesting thing here. We've now looked at 2 clips that are both from the first episode. We're now going to jump to closer to the end of the show to one of, for me, the most stylized moments in the whole show in terms of all of that we've been talking about in terms of the mixed genres and all that. I'd like to take a look at this and then talk a little bit about how we came from where we were in the beginning to where we are here.
You owe me an apology, mate. And a 90 seconds for the algorithm, yeah?
I told you, your failures would catch up to you.
IDF bastard! Who recruited you? Mossad? IDF. 100% Mossad.
I told you.
He's not Dev Patel. He's much too short.
You can't handle them alone. I told you that you need to be... him. Yes, the strong must replace the weak. Your turn now, Shah. This is the only way. Can't you see? Surrender! Surrender!
No. No. No.
How bad is it?
No, it's not bad. It's not bad. It's not too bad.
I feel like it's pretty bad. Feels like I'm missing an eye. Am I missing an eye?
You're gonna be okay. All right? You're gonna be okay.
Oh, it's cold. It's so cold. I don't want to die.
Stay. I can't do this without you.
I know you really can't. That other guy, though, the one chasing you, he had potential. Why did you resist?
You tell me. You're the only one who gets it. You're the only one who gets me. That's why I need you. But I don't even know who you were.
I was who you needed me to be. Hidden inside the voice of Patrick Stewart. Which is weird. You might want to unpack that.
No, don't go. No, we're a team, okay?
Good luck without me, dickhead.
Hey. Hey. Hey.
So first of all, I just want to say in response to that clip, it is such a shocking scene in a show in which up until now it's felt very much like we were in a comedy with some other genres blending in, but now we've gone deeply into something so shocking and so violent that I'd love to hear more in terms of how stylistically you shifted into that moment. But I want to start with the dialogue, because one interesting thing about this scene for me is that, you know, one of the things we talk a lot about when we're talking about dialogue is, well, was it ADR or was that the natural production dialogue? And in a lot of ways, this scene felt to me, in a good way, very ADR'd stylistically, in that we were suddenly in this moment that was so unrealistic and so stylized and so in his head. And I would love to hear from you, Steve, about how some of those choices were made in order to give this scene the tone that it required.
I mean, the way they wanted to do it is very much run lines together in the room. So Riz was there and they were both reading from a script and just trying different things, trying alternative lines for certain cues. And yeah, they just wanted to be able to bounce off of each other. So for these, you know, this bit at the end, these conversational moments, yeah, it was very much recording it wild, so not to picture. And then, you know, the main thing was to get that performance from Patrick.
I was who you needed me to be, hidden inside the voice of Patrick Stewart, which is weird.
And, you know, Riz knew, he knows these episodes so well. He knows where it's going to go, where it's going to lie, and he just needs to get that performance. It worked in that respect, the way they bounced off of each other. And it was then a case of, right, we've now got these lines, let's recut the picture around the audio. So I'd say in my experience, you do it the other way around normally. You know, you've got your locked picture and you record it to picture. But his voice is so important. His lines are so important that they did it the other way around. And I think that's why it works so well, you know?
And I even mean absolutely, but I mean not even just that part of the scene, but the whole scene.
Yeah.
Because there was something in the larger group scene that while I was watching it, it almost gave me that feeling of like kung fu action movie. Like I would not have been surprised to almost see the lines and the mouth movement end up not completely in sync, because that was the tonal sense.
There's a scene earlier at the party, isn't there, where I can't remember the character's name now, but this is like a sort of Bollywood style action sequence where the guy who's going out with Q turns up and sort of appears in this sort of like ridiculous, like oversaturated picture, and he sort of cartwheels across the swimming pool, and
yes.
And it's got very Bollywoody style music on, and that was sort of the first hint of that style, I think. And I think then you sort of move on, and there's a few episodes before we then get to this episode. But I think partly that thing you're picking up on in the alleyway is it's slightly sort of exaggerated. It's not quite real action. It's sort of exaggerated action. It's sort of, you know, the whooshes and the stabs and the gunshots and the hits and the Foley's all sort of slightly heightened to give it that slightly sort of not real feel, whilst also, you know, it's then also got sort of like Bond style music playing under it. So it's a sort of such a weird mix of influences going on.
No, I was going to say there were lots of kind of vocalizations that are put on. Like the more obvious one is when he off screen stabs the granny with the pipe. and she
Yeah,
makes this sort of like, oh, this guttural sort of
she
sound. But
nailed that
again,
one in ADR.
everyone had. I mean, I don't know if the dialogue right at the beginning where he's being accused of being Mossad, or where I don't know if that was ADR or
I
if that
think
was
that wasn't
production.
ADR actually. I think that was
But
sync.
I think the way we kind of got that slightly kind of artificial or kind of otherworldly feeling was that actually for the previous scene, we'd been running down the street or something. We'd had a lot of buzz from the London background and stuff. But by the time we got into the alleyway, we sort of sucked away all of the background sound, really. And we just ended up with Foley and dialogue stripped quite clean. And then adding in all these little vocalizations when someone gets shot, they go, ah. And, when they're having the sort of the fight with the pipe, there's that kind of slightly kung fu kind of effort sound added on.
It's all quite pastiche, isn't it? I mean, as you say, it wouldn't have been completely out. It wouldn't have been completely inappropriate, as you say, to just have a bit of dialogue and then the mouth continues and it's not in sync. I mean, that would have been maybe taking it a bit far. But it's that vibe of trying to. He's sort of constantly pastiching different genres and leaning into influences. And I'd sort of I'd forgotten about that. But yeah, that was definitely an influence in that scene. It wasn't just going to be a sort of Bourne Ultimatum James Bond style action sequence, because it probably have a few more layers of things. It was very much about pulling stuff away to sort of land that heightened sense, I think. And then, as you say,
with the where he shoots the spray can out of his hand, and you just got a gunshot, then you got ding, and then clatter of the thing. It's very much like rhythmical, like we were talking about earlier, but also it's like, you just hear a gunshot, you just hear the ricochet, you just hear something else, and everything's got its little place, and there's air in between those sounds, if you know what I mean. That's probably kind of where we push it editorially, and then in the mix kind of almost sort of push it even further in that direction.
And of course, the whole way through that, we've also got, I mean, possibly for viewers of this who've not seen the whole show, obviously go and watch the show. But to suddenly, you're probably watching it thinking, where's Patrick Stewart's voice coming from? Of what happens is the pig's head takes on a sort of meaning to Shah the whole way through the show, and this sort of conversational discourse happens between the pig's head and Shah throughout. And sometimes he's like muffled in the bag, and sometimes he's sort of telling Shah what to do. And in that scene, on top of everything else, you've got to have Patrick Stewart's voice as the pig's head, sort of narrating to Shah what he's doing wrong or what he should be doing. Or so again, you couldn't have made the scene too serious, because the whole way through you've got this utterly crazy sort of like this ridiculous voice going the whole way through, sort of narrating to Shah. And then obviously it does have that brilliant sort of payoff at the end, which makes me laugh every single time I watch it. It was really sad as well. You get quite fond of the pig's head. But when you think about the way it appears in the show, and then how he's sort of so dependent on it as a sort of emotional support, and you're the only one who understands me, and then his parting words, he just calls him dickhead and dies.
It was quite hard not to laugh, actually, because it was recorded in one room. It wasn't like a booth. We're all in one room, and the script was quite new to me, and the way he delivers it was so hard not to laugh.
Sort of stifling the laughter, like over the best take,
exactly.
And you're like, don't ruin it.
I think I'm far enough away from the mic to get away with a little giggle.
I mean, I think it's quite important to maybe mention how we ended up mixing Patrick Stewart's voice, because originally it was strictly voiceover like sort of in Shah's head all the time. And it just wasn't working for some reason. Obviously Patrick's performance was great. You could hear everything, it was fine, but it just wasn't working. And I think it might have been Ben, the other showrunner, Ben Carlin, who said, well, what would it be like if we're actually hearing it in the room? Let's try when he's in the bag.
Diegetically.
Muffle the voice. And then there's a bit, I think it's earlier in Ep 5, where you hear it muffled, and then Shah opens the bag. I think it may be the first time.
In the police
the first time you hear it, and then suddenly the EQ changes, and you realize, okay, you're hearing it from the bag, now it's out of the bag. And then we tried to put a bit of movement into it when he's running. with the bag and find that, I remember, Steve, you dug out the best sort of take with the right kind of movement
Bit of
of him
movement
when
to
he
his
says
voice, yeah, a bit
surrender,
breathier. Yeah.
And just to kind of sell the fact that actually Shah's really imagining this thing speaking to him from the bag, not just in his head.
It's such a complicated thing to sell as well, isn't it? Because the pig's head appears quite early on, maybe in episode 1 or episode 2, where he opens the freezer and it's there.
Yeah.
But then it's not, you don't see the pig for a little while, do you? And then it's probably not until, is it episode 5 that the pig makes much more of an appearance? And then, yeah, you have to quite quick. I mean, I think it's fair to say that when they were doing it, they didn't really know how it was going to work, because obviously they shot the stuff with the pig, but they didn't shoot Patrick's voice until late, like when we were in post. And so it was really a lot of brave filmmaking to come up with this whole concept of how this pig is going to be, what the voice is going to sound like. Patrick's got such an identifiable voice. But clearly understands the comedy. He's delivered it so well. Quite often it's voiceovery. Sometimes it's sort of quite sharp insults and sort of comedy banter. And you'd be like, well, we need to find some fast takes to get the sort of momentum going. And sometimes maybe they'd been recorded more like voiceover takes. And it took a lot of work to get it into shape. And as Steve said, they ended up retiming the picture in a few places to make, they'd settle on a performance they loved from Patrick, and then it wouldn't quite fit. So they'd lengthen the cut rather than lose the performance, which is a lovely way of working. It's a sort of indulgence to be able to do that, I think, in post, to be able to open up the picture and change the edit, which personally,
and while we're in mix as well.
Yeah, whilst we're mixing, I mean, I'm all for it. The tools available now are so sophisticated that allow us to recut as we work. But I do think sometimes you can't know how something is going to work until you can look at it in the edit, but that's not the final sort of picture of everything. And so when you get into the mix, if something doesn't quite work, to be able to open up the edit is lovely. But yeah, just the sort of whole way that voice worked at the end worked really, really well, choosing the right takes and getting the right vibe. And I think very tricky to shoot that. So it's such a sterile environment of an ADR studio, but to get a performance and a read that works in such a sort of variety of different ways, culminating in a sort of like killer insult just at the end, and then he dies. I think it's very clever writing.
I was just going to say, to go back, Steve, to what you were saying at the very beginning of this, with how you all cut around the recorded dialogue lines at the end. One interesting thing is, because of how stylized and crazy the whole alleyway scene was, all of a sudden that moment of him talking to the pig's head suddenly feels like what's realistic and what's real and what's personal. And it almost becomes moving, and which is why I think you laugh so hard at the end when he says dickhead, because you're like, oh my God, he's losing his friend. And oh, right, his friend is a pig's head,
It's such a great British insult, that as well. I love it. It's like, it's classic.
It's just switching between light and dark all the time, which is, it makes the payoff. It makes the joke even funnier, doesn't it? We've just had that quite dark moment. And everyone's looking at him. People are filming him. And he's clearly lost his mind. And then you get that joke at the end. It's just like...
I remember your work on the... I remember your work on the crowd there, Steve, was tricky right at the end. Do you remember we had a lot more kind of voices going on in the background, and then they were like, it's not working, and then you just ended up with that one line. It's like, oh my God, are you all right? That's the only line you hear, and it's just because it's like just on its own, really clear, and then you can't really hear anything else apart from a very low muttering sort of sound. You think, why is that funny? But it is.
That's the comedy thing again. That's the thing of, like, you've got one tiny moment. We're not even looking at that person, and you just hear that one line, and then you don't hear anything else. Like, you don't need to hear anything else. You don't want to hear a load of voices.
Yeah, it's more powerful thinking that everyone's standing around completely shocked. So shocked that they're not speaking to each other. When they're all chatting away to each other, it takes away from that a little bit,
Well, one final little kind of bonus topic I want to introduce by first sharing two little short anecdotes with you. I was able to attend an editing panel years ago with Thelma Schoonmaker, in which she did an editorial breakdown of the final fight scene of Raging Bull, which is when I learned, because she talked so much about the sound work in the film, because she is, by the way, one of those people where she will never say my work is great. She will say, well, it was great because of this person. It was great because of that person. And so it was in that panel that I learned that in the final fight scene of Raging Bull, if you listen, you can hear horses and elephants during the fight scene, because that was the sound they landed on in order to add that primal sort of violence to the scene. Wow. And then at another panel that was actually hosted by Manhattan Edit Workshop, I got to hear the whole sound team from Life of Pi. And their sound designer and supervising sound editor, Eugene Garrity, who lived in the Outer Banks in North Carolina, talked during that panel about how when the big storms would come into the Outer Banks, while everybody else was running for shelter, he was running out to his car so he could drive around with a digital recorder out the window to capture sound, sounds of storms. The result of that being that in Life of Pi, when you hear the ship sinking, a lot of what you're hearing is actually a storm from the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And what I wanted to ask you all, and think of this as a way of providing an Easter egg, so anybody who hasn't seen the show, who watches this panel might think, oh, now I need to go watch the show so I can look for that. Do any of you have any little favorite moment that you can share where you did something unexpected in the show, where you used a sound that maybe is not what we should expect, or you did something where somebody's going to say, oh, now I need to go watch that scene to see if I can find that or listen to that?
That's a tricky
question. You didn't put
question.
Wilhelm screaming, did you, Jack?
I'm not sure. I mean, quite often, you've got these hero sounds that you try and kind of shoehorn in for a laugh. And I think at one point Ben was asking us to put the Wilhelm scream in for the fight scene that we just watched, and it didn't end up making the cut.
I was gonna say I didn't hear it.
Yeah, it's a really tricky question on this one, because nothing springs to mind in terms of like, oh, I remember there was one show where there was I can't remember which show it was. I think maybe it was Mr. Selfridge or something, like years ago. That's Jeremy Piven playing Mr. Selfridge. But I remember, for example, there was a scene where someone was on stage and everyone was laughing at him. And I put the sound of like a turkey gobble over the sound of a shot of a woman laughing at him, and it just had that kind of
I remember that
insane kind of laugh. But I'm racking my brains now trying to remember if I did anything like that in Bait. I mean, there were quite a few odd sounds in this show. But yeah,
I can't think of anything, to be honest.
And that was why I said I included this at the end of the little bonus topic, because if you answer with that, they don't have to include this in the final panel. But I wanted to, because of the nature of the sound of the show, I thought there might be something.
Yeah.
To be honest, the Wilhelm scream is the obvious example of a sound sort of, we've all seen the reels of like endlessly used in Spielberg films and so on. In a way, there was so much sort of original content in this that you almost couldn't go into it with a preconceived idea of what might work. And so I would say a lot of the work we did on this was really kind of not firefighting, that's the wrong expression, but I don't think I've been in a mix where it's been so hands-on in terms of like, here's something we presented, and it's kind of like, there's a great example. There's a restaurant scene in episode 4. It's the end of Eid, and it's where he bumps into his ex-girlfriend, and we did what we would usually do, put crowd in, and then Riz obviously knows the area, knows the vibe and the cultural significance of the moment and the time, and how at the end of Eid everyone goes and celebrates, and he's like, needs more. So we'd put in more crowd and more sound. It needs more. You don't really necessarily see it, but you start off with an idea of what you think you're going to do, and then you just have to listen to the people giving you the notes about it needs more of this or it needs more of that. And so I don't think there's anything I can think of where we're like, oh well, let's put this little thing in here. Riz is he's too sharp to get away with something like that. I think we wouldn't have got away with it. He'd be like, "What's that sound?" He doesn't miss anything. So it'd be like, "Why is that sound in there?" There may even have been some things in there, but I don't think they lasted. You always try and put
from an ADR point of view, I'm pretty sure when they're in the club and they're doing the face paint, I'm pretty sure that is all ADR. So
might be, yeah.
I'm fairly certain all of that is ADR. So I mean, hopefully the sync's good on that. Now I've said it.
I mean, I will tell you, I am somebody who is very picky about ADR, and when I'm watching something where I can see it, it takes me out. I was not taken out once during the show.
Right.
So, and normally it's an interesting thing. Normally what takes you out is not necessarily sync. It's that the tone feels wrong.
Yeah.
And that was just a random story, which again, doesn't have to stay in this panel. On that Life of Pi panel, I asked because it turns out that the movie Life of Pi was like 90% ADR because they filmed it in an above ground pool next to a highway in Taiwan, I think. And I asked them during the Q&A, I'm like, I never saw ADR. How did you do it? And the way they did it was they took the same mic from set on a boom pole and put him in a big room and just ran around behind him as he spoke. So it would have the same sense.
Nice.
But
I wish I
again,
could do that.
but again,
we need a big enough ADR room to do that.
And so again, what normally takes you out with ADR is hearing, well, they're walking down the street, but there's no breath in their sound, in their voice, like they're walking. I never saw that in this. That's a thing that normally that's what takes you out. And I didn't see it.
There is a sound thing that you can listen for in this, which is I've just thought of, which is that one of the things that happened quite early on is that Riz wanted to incorporate his breaths into the soundtrack in a sort of variety of different ways. And what happened quite early on is I think he came in and did a load of recordings of breaths, slow breaths, intense breaths, fast breaths. They then got given to the composer. The composer then wrote the score using Riz's breaths. There's a lot of sort of like that sort of thing in the score, if you give my impression. And that sort of became an instrument that was used throughout in some of the sort of the more sort of action-y types of score and some of the sort of more horror-y sort of flashback getting into his head style stuff. But also when we were in the mix, some of those breaths worked and some of them don't. They were slowed right down or sped up or treated or reverbed or EQ'd and so on. And then so Riz, because we had an ADR studio next to where we were on the same floor as the stage we were mixing in, Riz would go and record some more breaths and gave them to Jack. And then Jack then did sound design on the breaths. So there's a sort of breath theme that runs throughout, which is the kind of Riz. I think you sort of first see it, don't you, when he looks at himself in the mirror, looking at himself as James Bond in like the first couple of scenes. You start to get the breaths come in there, and then they sort of, these breaths run through the soundtrack. They become score at some point, and they become sound design in the club. I think we use quite a lot of sound design in the club, which is the breaths. There's a lot of breaths as we build up to that crescendo in the clip we saw where he bursts out the back of the club door. There's breaths used there. And I think if you're listening to something that you sort of, if you're watching the soundtrack to find out how these breaths are used, that's quite an interesting sort of motif that runs through it, is that it sort of spans. We've got just regular ADR breaths, like breaths walking down the road. There's breaths in the flashback sequences. There's breaths in the music. There's breaths in the score and the sound design. And it's quite an interesting sort of original thought that Riz had. And then we were able to sort of weave it through the various things that we were doing. And I think it makes appearances at various points and then disappears for a while. But yeah, that's something to look out for, perhaps.
His concept was basically about what it feels like to have a panic attack. So I think it's sort of a hyperventilating sort of breath. And then just as Richard said, sometimes we would get to a scene and it wasn't quite intense enough. And then he would sort of, go away and re-record them. And we found ourselves maybe in episodes 4 or 5, and he'd recorded some breaths that he was really happy with, and then he was like, we need these in episode 1. So we'd jump back to episode 1 when we had the time, maybe the next day, and introduce the stuff that we had come to in episode 5 back into episode 1. So there was, there was a lot of jumping around episodically, to try and get that journey, that journey for Shah, but essentially kind of like losing his grip with reality, and where you would get to from episode 1 to sort of episode 6, where it resolves, and then being able to, just with the way that we can work nowadays, being able to kind of have a concept develop over the course of the mixes between episode 1 and 6, and then jump back to episode 1 and put ideas from episode 5 into episode 1 all of a sudden, and then it was
there was a lot of opening up of work that we thought was finished to just make it a bit better.
Yeah.
Which, fortunately, because it's Amazon delivery, I think we delivered everything at the end rather than, sometimes you deliver things as you go. But this was definitely a show where we kept sort of, as Jack said, because the sort of narrative and the story arc was so, you could almost like draw it on a line. When you came to an idea that you had done in a later ep, you thought, oh, hang on, does this definitely kind of play? Does it appear at the right rate or the right speed, or have we introduced it too early or too late? And so there was a bit of that going on, which was nice. I mean, it's nice. And again, that's part of the reason why having Riz and Ben there the whole time, able to sort of be the sort of creative voice for the whole 6 episodes, rather than, sometimes when you work on a show, you have different crews working on different episodes and you end up with like quite a disparate sounding show. This was very much it was molded from sort of 10,000 feet. I think it felt like they knew what the shape was, and it was just a case of, when you're sort of wading through the weeds of it a little bit, you do have to allow yourself the time to sort of watch it back and go, oh, okay, yeah. And then we'd review with the execs, and it's always a good process when the execs and the showrunners and the producers come and watch stuff and give you those notes that you haven't necessarily noticed yourself. But yeah, setting that overall tone, and the breaths thing is definitely one that I remember working on quite hard. And Jamie was the music editor, was incorporating it into all his instruments and all sorts.
Jamie would be a whole separate interview.
Yeah, you could do an entire
because he really
he worked.
Just not to just sing his praises while he's not here, but like he what he did with that music edit was really extraordinary.
Astonishing, actually. I don't think I've ever seen a music editor work so hard. He really put in a shift on that. But that second clip that we watched is a really, it's a real testament to his work, because rhythmically it's so interesting, it's so cutty, it's so dynamic, but it's not repetitive, and it's just very, very, very clever use of music, I think, throughout that. And we were really kind of working. This was what was interesting, is that in that sequence is that we, when we're doing our bit, we haven't even heard the music, so you don't even know necessarily what the music's going to be. And the music wasn't the same as what was in the cutting copy. It was completely different, and then it would also change halfway through the mix. So the whole time you're sort of going, right, well, the music's changed now to this. How do we get these other elements to now behave themselves with this music that's kind of music sequence, really? So yeah, it was a beautiful kind of collaborative process, actually. Like, I think by the end we were all we were really excited by it, but it was we were all exhausted. But it was really a really lovely thing to do. A rare treat, I would say, for us.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say, this whole discussion has made me want to go back and watch it again.
Me too.
And listen for the breaths.
And listen for all these things. Just thinking that.
But also, for anybody watching this panel who hasn't watched the show yet, now you have to watch the show and listen for some of these things. And I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. This show was such a successful and brilliant use of sound, and such a great choice of a show to talk to a sound team, because of the kind of work you all did. And I really appreciate all the insight you all have given us, and especially hearing how much, Riz Ahmed and his involvement in it, and because of his, his expertise with sound, how that fed into this and all of it. All right. Well, thank you all so much. This was fun. And
thank you.
I learned a lot. I appreciate it. And I hope you all work together again soon, and we'll bring you back and talk to you again soon.
Great.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much,
Thanks
Amy.
very much.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Take care. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Everybody, thank you so much for watching Sight, Sound, and Story Inside the Sound of Veep. Hope you enjoyed it. It's episode 60, 61 coming up in a week or so. I want to thank our friends at American Cinema Editors and Filmmaker U and Edit Stock, and of course, Janet Dalton and Jason Banky behind the scenes at Manhattan Workshop, making it all happen. Like us on the socials. Let us know if there are things that you want to see. We will try to do them. And until next time, thank you so much for watching.